Okay, our next podcast is going to go into looking at the structure where these chemical reactions of metabolism take place. So we just got through talking about um, energy and metabolic reactions, enzymes that help speed those up, and that type thing. Now we want to look at where these type things take place in the cell. And they generally take place on membranes, so the membrane structure is very important. We discussed the membrane structure a little bit when we looked at the major macromolecules or the large biological molecules. When we looked at lipids, there's a type of lipid called phospholipids, and these are the major component of the membranes around our cells, and also around organelles. Many of the organelles have these membranes as well, made up of these phospholipids. Now these membranes, let's look at, here is an example. All right, so here shows our membrane here. The phospholipids, as we discussed when we looked at those with the molecules, have three sections, or really two parts. The tails, it has two, they're referred to as tails. They're fatty acid chains, and then what's referred to as a head section, and that's the phosphate group that's attached there. And the head, or the phosphate group, is hydrophilic. Water can surround it. It can attract water, so it's hydrophilic, so it can be around water. The tails right here are hydrophobic, and so they kind of repel water. So in our cells, the membranes, there's two layers of these, and they come together at the tails. The heads point out of the cell, and the other layer, the head points into the cell. And so this is going to keep water and many of the dissolved substances in the water either outside the cell or inside the cell, which is good. Now, there is certain things that are allowed to come through these membranes, and that's what we're going to get into. But that ability to allow certain things to come in and not allow other things to come in is called selectively permeable. So that's a phrase that's often applied to these membranes. They're selectively permeable. All right. Now, also, these membranes are not just made up of these phospholipids. There's many other things in those, primarily proteins. Here we see some regions of these proteins that are kind of sandwiched in there, in that phospholipid bilayer. These proteins play important roles in that permeability that the membrane has. They can assist things coming in and out of the cell, or the organelle if it's a membrane just around an organelle. Now, also there's the proteins. There's sugars and other substances in these membranes. Shows an example here: cholesterol and other different types of proteins, and lipids, some glycolipids attached to it. But anyway, this is the membrane, and when you look at it with all of the structures attached to it, it's motile. It moves. It can move about. It's not static. And so, in looking at the membrane in this fashion, we can refer to it as the fluid mosaic model. So that is often applied to it. Now, the membrane it protects the cell or the organelle to not allow certain things to come in. It also is a major site for enzymatic activity, and it helps, membrane can help join other cells to it. So there's a lot of functions that the membrane plays out, but one of the major functions is this permeability, allowing things to come in and out. Now, in coming in and out of the cell, we have certain processes. Some of these processes that allow things to come into the cell require energy, and other processes do not require energy. So in our outline here, we have these distinguish between physical processes and physiological processes. So the physical processes are those that do not require energy. So that's the physical process where there is no energy requirement. And the other process of moving things from one side of the membrane to the other does require energy, and that process is referred to as a physiological process where there's cellular energy required. So here, let's see, let's look at this example. So here's an example of movement. So here's our membrane, there's a protein. Often proteins will shuttle and help move things across. Sometimes they just move through the phospholipids, but here's some solutes here that are going to move into the cell, and they go through this the protein channel here, and they end up in the cytoplasm of the cell, but no energy was required for that process. Let's see here if I have an example of one. Yeah, here's a better, okay, this is a better one. Okay, so this shows, so another phrase for that is passive and active transport. So passive transport is that physical process where no energy is required. So here's 3 examples of that passive transport. So again, like the image we just looked at, there's these solutes here are moving across the membrane. These are moving across the membrane. So here in the active transport, we have energy is a requirement for this transport to occur. So in your textbook, ATP, which we just talked about in the last podcast, adenosine triphosphate, is the molecule that is going to fuel these reactions. So the bonds of the phosphate are going to be released, and energy will be released when they break, when those bonds break, and that fuels this process. So this is called either active transport, or in your outline it's called physiological process, where that energy is required. So there's some different types here of passive transport. Sometimes the molecules just go straight through the membrane. In this case, like diffusion is an example of that, and osmosis. Another example is where these molecules move through proteins, but they do not require energy to move through these proteins. That's called facilitated diffusion. And then the other example is where energy is required. Now, your book will always use, when it's describing energy, and with the ATP molecule, it has this little yellow, what they call a burst, and that's representing energy. So energy in here is required for that physiological process. Now let's look at some of these examples. Here's an example of diffusion. So this dotted line represents our membrane. Here's some solutes, some molecules that are on this side of the membrane, and they move across because there's lower concentration over here. There's actually no concentration of those ions over here. And they move across until they reach this equilibrium. Now they just move straight through the membrane, and they tend toward this equilibrium. This can happen with multiple molecules where they will move back and forth until they reach this equilibrium. So again, this is an example of a physical process called diffusion. Another example is osmosis. Osmosis is a kind of diffusion of water molecules. So it's specifically diffusion of water molecules. So here's representing our membrane right here in this tube. And so the water molecules move. So we have a solute over here and a solute over here, and the water molecules tend to move over to an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration until we reach that equilibrium. The equilibrium is between the solute and the water. So we need more water over here. It'll move across, even against gravity, till it reaches this equilibrium. That's called osmosis, and that's again a physical process. And the physiological are those that require energy. This does not require any energy input. Okay, the last thing we mentioned here in talking about the membrane, the site of these metabolic reactions, is not only can molecules move across these membranes in these different fashions, but we can often the cell will need a lot of bulk material either out of the cell or into the cell. So this bulk transport across these membranes occurs in a different way. And it will occur through the use of vesicles or vacuoles that will either come off of the membrane or be attached to the membrane. There's two types of this bulk transport. One's called endocytosis and the other is called exocytosis. So again, this is where the cell's going to take these larger material. Here's some examples here. So this is an example of endocytosis. This is a taking in food material. This is an amoeba. Okay, so this is an amoeba here. So we have this food material is taken from outside the cell of this amoeba, and it pulls it in, and when it pulls it in, it forms a vacuole around it. So it takes the membrane right here and it just snaps off that section of the membrane and makes a little vacuole. So this can happen with food material, with certain molecules, so this occurs when it comes into the cell. We refer to that as endocytosis. Easy to remember, entering endo, and if it is throwing stuff out of the cell, if there's a vacuole that has material, it can go to the membrane and then throw it out. That's called exocytosis, exiting the cell. Okay, so this is our introduction to the site where these metabolic reactions take place, the membranes, and now we're going to start looking at these major metabolic reactions. There's two major metabolic reactions that occur in living organisms: cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So we have two major metabolic reactions we'll look at, but also in this unit we're going to look at cell division. So that's what we have coming up.